So I just want to take time to apologize if my viewing comes off different, just because I'm not really looking at the camera. I'm reading a message off the screen. My name's Gene Adam, and I'm here to basically talk about a woman who's been wrongfully imprisoned for 26 years and is to remain in jail until she dies. This is about the grave miscarriage of justice carried out by the Huntsville Police Department and the state of Alabama in framing Betty Woods Wilson. So in 1992, Mrs. Wilson lost not only her husband, but her freedom to go along with it. After a trial basically spiraled out of control, Betty was convicted of conspiracy of first-degree murder and has been imprisoned ever since. I'm here to shine a light on her case, appealing to the public and to gain the attention of Governor Kay Ivey and the United States Department of Justice to investigate this case thoroughly. My intention is to have Betty Woods brought to justice that she deserves while explaining the investigation, trial, conviction, and aftermath. So let's review the crime, shall we? May 22nd, 1992. Betty Wilson returns from an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting to find her husband beaten and murdered at their place of residence. She immediately fled the scene and in fear called 911 from a neighbor's telephone.
Listen, this is the police department. Talk to me, okay? Were you in the house or did you walk in the house? Okay, you come home and you walked in the house and you saw this person laying on the floor. Who is the person to you? Okay, do you know if the person that hurt him is still inside?
I don't know. I guess
Okay. Now you just go stand there and you don't go back to your house, okay? And we've got an ambulance and we've got the police on the way.
When police arrived, they discovered the deceased beaten with what is believed to be a bat that was found next to the body with blood on the bat. He was also discovered with 2 stab woundings. I repeat, they discovered the deceased beaten with what is believed to be a bat that was found nearby with blood on the bat. He was also discovered with 2 stab woundings. I repeat, they discovered the deceased beaten with what is believed to be a bat that was found nearby with blood on the bat. He was also discovered with 2 stab woundings. They also found a ski mask at the place of residence and believe it was an intent for burglary. Although there were no open drawers or flipped furniture, they discovered the deceased's wallet with no cash in the wallet, but with credit cards still intact. After investigating the scene, police created a theory that Wilson was surprised by someone who had broken into the house, grabbed the baseball bat, and beat the doctor and proceeded to stab him with a knife and fled the scene. All of this is a created theory and never proven. The investigation leading to the alleged perpetrator came upon the fact that in a nearby town, police were informed of a man known as James White, who had confessed to killing the doctor in Huntsville while he was drunk. The informant knew of Mr. White's habits of false claims and lies when drinking and doubted his story, but still informed the police of his claims. Police then followed through with the tip. He's picked up and interrogated, and this is where the story takes a circus ride. Let's review James White's history. James White, at this time, is a 42-year-old Vietnam veteran with a dishonorable discharge from the military. He has a history of criminal activity and serving jail time. He has a history of mental disorders and antisocial behavior. He is known well of his drinking and drug habits. He's an alleged pedophile, and he spent a number of times in mental institutions as well prior to this. One evaluator noted, while serving time for drugs, he escaped and was captured almost a year later in Arkansas, where he was involved with kidnapping a man and his wife. On one of his last mental evaluations, they described him as suffering from delusions and unable to separate fact from fantasy. With all this said, and relating to the police's theory of the crime, James White would be interrogated for 10 whole hours. We know, as the people, interrogations are tough enough, and after 10 hours, even a sane person would let go into saying anything necessary to basically relieve themselves. Also, is there any record of informing him of legal expertise? Was this man given food, water, all this during his interrogation, or was it to say what you need to get out of this interview? So what happened during these 10 hours? At first, Mr. White denied the whole thing. He denied being involved with the whole case. And even on Thought Code, they paint the setting just as the sun was peeking over the horizon after these 10 hours is when White confessed to the murder. This is when he claimed to be hired by Betty Wilson and her twin sister Peggy Lowe to kill Dr. Jack Wilson. After the original confession, the following several months his story would change several times. Throughout this process, Jack Wilson was given a deal to testify against the twin sisters in exchange for no death penalty. As a result, in his case, he was given life with the possibility of parole after 7 years to testify against the twins. So let's review his case claims. James White claimed that the twin sisters conspired to have Dr. Wilson killed. His claim was that he knew Peggy Lowe from the elementary school she worked and where he had previously done carpentry work. White claimed Peggy Lowe became infatuated with him and spent time with him talking on the phone. He claimed that she wanted her husband killed during these conversations. After this, he claimed she left him with the subject of her sister hiring a hitman and said he knew someone who would do it for $20,000. Mrs. Lowe then said that price was too high and that her sister was broke. White's murder claims to the trial of Peggy and Betty were huge. First and foremost, he had stated that he had been intoxicated on the night of the murder.
Drinking for the last 3 or 4 days, popping pills, drinking, smoking dope, and all I knew is I wanted to get away.
He has never stated willingly, under oath, or for the matter anywhere else that he used the bat to kill him. It's always, I think I used a bat.
They say the man got beat with a baseball bat, but I don't remember a baseball bat being around nowhere. But I do remember that I hit the man, he turned me loose.
I repeat, they discovered the deceased beaten with what is believed to be a bat that was found nearby with blood on the bat. He was also discovered with 2 stab woundings. Jack White does not remember killing the doctor. He claims that after the murder, Mrs. Wilson picked him up and drove him back to his truck so that he could go out with his brother that night. When police searched James White's residence, they found a gun belonging to Betty Wilson, and he claimed that this gun was given to him to order out the killing. And then they found shoes with blood on them, matching the deceased's blood type. Police claim this checked out because White was able to afford to pay his bills while in an overdraft. They also found in his place of residence a library book belonging to Betty Wilson. The matching link of the murder was found and the conspiracy of the murder was believed to be proven at this point. They would arrest the sisters and then charge them with conspiracy. So a little bit about the trial. The twin sisters, Betty and Peggy, were tried separately. Betty was tried first, and even before the trial began, there was still a strange outcome in the pretrial as Peggy Lowe was granted bond and Betty was remanded until her trial. The evidence surrounding the conspiracy were slim to none. You have the library book and the gun found in James White's possession aligning with his testimony they had already changed several times. Therefore, instead of dropping the charges, the prosecution did one of the most outlandish things in the entire case. They relied on the testimony of James White and challenged the behavior of Betty Wilson as motive.
I cannot believe a maniac, cold-blooded murder over a human being that's never been in trouble with the law.
Mrs. Wilson maintained an open relationship with her husband, and he was well aware of her affairs with other men and was unbothered by this.
Maggie Seamy added that even if Betty Wilson did have affairs, she shouldn't be judged for that. Late today, one of Betty Wilson's defense attorneys actually came right out and told potential jurors that Betty Wilson did indeed have a number of extramarital affairs.
He sat me down one day and he said, "You're suffocating me." He went on to tell me that very day, have an affair, have a dozen affairs, but don't suffocate me.
You're telling me your husband gave you permission to have multiple affairs?
Yes. He said that's what married people do.
The prosecution used this as theory for motive to kill. They also used the fact that she had an estate worth $6 million, which Dr. Wilson's family filed a suit to keep Betty from his estate.
One of the investigators said you had 6 million reasons to want him dead. And he was referring to some $6 million that made up his estate.
You know, that's a pretty cheap shot, you know, for him to say 6 million reasons. I had 6 million reasons to want him alive.
As the case continued, new information came from good old James Wilson. He suddenly recalled that at the place of the murder, he had changed clothes in the house and placed them in a plastic bag along with a rope and knife and hid them under a rock a few feet away from the swimming pool. The bag was supposedly the same bag that he had received the money from Peggy Lowe. Many folks, to include members of the Huntsville Police Department, were skeptical about the clothes, that they were missed in the initial search, and that the explanation the police dog had an allergy is the reason the dog missed this. Even after the clothes were found, forensic analysis were not able to determine whether the clothes had been blood-stained. Well, to conclude that finding, there's only one of two options. Either they were or they weren't, or in fact they weren't tested at all. Another finding came during the investigation was the lack of forensic evidence. The bat at the scene had only blood on it and didn't even show a positive match for any fingerprints. Another main finding of the case is the car Betty Wilson drove. James White claimed Betty Wilson picked him up and drove him to a location to go out with his brother. Yet, when the car was tested, analysis found no trace fibers, no skin cells, no fingerprints of James White, and no DNA of the deceased. If you put in predicament that this man had just killed somebody, he would have some blood on him, whether it be his or the deceased, as stabbing cases often result in the perpetrator cutting themselves as well. But nothing was found in the car. And even the ideas that were left there were changed, and you removed the idea that no blood was found on the clothes. Here's a finding: nothing else was found as well. If you analyze a situation, when you strike someone to kill them, there would be some clothes with blood on them. If it wasn't found in the car or on the clothes in the bag, where are the traces? As the case furthered, the sad reality came to light that a person's freedom was in jeopardy, all because of James White's testimony to save himself. To review the case, we see the entire thing as backwards. Usually, in cases, the prosecution will rely on solid evidence and facts, while the defense will create a theory to raise reasonable doubt. In this case, the prosecution relied on testimony from James White, who not only has not had a credible background, but has changed the story consistently throughout the investigation and the trial proceedings. The prosecution claimed that James White was credible due to the record of phone calls in the library book, while the defense testified in helping White in times of need.
Mr. White told me his wife had divorced him and remarried and taken his children from him. He had to have work so that he could get his children back. So we gave him work at our house, and he just did little things, handyman things.
But White told investigators that the relationship quickly developed into something much more serious.
They began talking, communicating nightly. Sometimes they talked for hours on end, and phone records indicate that they talked many, 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 many times.
Can you characterize for us what you could possibly have been talking about for hours at a time sometimes?
At that time, Mr. White was calling me a lot. It was like something that Mr. White needed. And if you have ever known anybody who has gone through a really bad divorce, that's just all they could talk about. Now, I guess he talked to me because I would listen.
I felt like that was verging on being ridiculous, that the woman of her station in life with a husband would be talking to this fellow every night for hours at a time. I thought for a long time about the library book. As a former defense attorney, I thought if they could ever explain the book, that maybe that she had a chance, that maybe we couldn't win.
Peggy took the stand and attempted to do just that. She said her sister Betty had given James White $200 inside a library book through a handoff at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting.
I just felt like when I explained what had happened, that we were trying to help him, that people would understand.
What was that money for?
For him to get a place to sleep.
Don't you think that looks suspicious to the jury?
I guess if you knew anything about AA, it would not seem strange. That's a part of what we do. That's a part of who we are. You know, we help the alcoholic who's still suffering.
Peggy also testified she and her husband paid White to do work at their home because they were trying to help White through a tough time.
Mr. White told me that he was afraid that he would start drinking because his wife had divorced him.
The prosecution argued the gun was given to James White, and the defense testified that he stole it during the attack. The gun case was also opened and found in the homes afterwards in a visible area. Wouldn't you think to hide the case if you were conspiring this matter? The prosecution then presents witness after witness after witness. The first testified a recollection of an event 6 years earlier that Peggy wanted to kill her husband, while the defense testified that the woman continues to be friends with the defendant.
They called Betty's friends, members of her Alcoholics Anonymous group, and her husband's colleagues to testify against her.
We called a witness who had been a close friend of Betty Wilson's, who testified that Betty was thinking about killing Dr. Wilson.
Why would anybody testify that they had overheard you saying, "I wish my husband were dead," if it weren't true? Why would somebody make that up?
She's the kind of person who does very mean and spiteful things.
The less evidence the prosecution had relating to the murder, the more they tried to bring a case against her in testimony. The prosecution tried so hard to create Betty Wilson as a cold-hearted woman who wanted her husband dead for his estate and for his sexual affairs. It is evident the prosecution was not out to seek justice, but instead was out for a conviction.
The prosecution showed the jury images of Betty's home and extravagant possessions, painting a portrait of a spoiled woman obsessed with material things. And then there were the infidelities.
We were able to prove she had a lifestyle of promiscuity. Her own character basically was used against her as a motive for what she did.
The highlight of the case about the murder, in fact, had nothing to do with the murder. It was when a Black City employee took the stand against Betty Wilson and told stories of their affair and paint the picture of her promiscuity being the reasons that she wanted her husband dead. The prosecution denied playing the race card, but in retrospect, no offense, in Alabama, it's not easy to make that counter-argument. On March 3rd, 1993, after a 2-day deliberation, Betty Wilson was convicted of capital murder for hire and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. All in a case where there was little evidence against her, a testimony from a man with a terrible history, and where her intimate life choices were used in her judgment opposed to her relations to the case.
You were convicted. Why?
Because I was a rich bitch who had an affair with a black man.
Just like always, here again is where the story takes another turn. 6 months after the fact, Peggy Lowe would stand trial for the exact same crime. Same man testifying, same evidence, but the results in this case would be different. In Peggy Lowe's case, James White now stated that Betty Wilson picked him up between 6 and 6:30, which was an hour later than he originally testified in Betty's trial, meaning that it was impossible for Mrs. Wilson to participate in picking him up because her whereabouts during those hours were accounted for. In this case, the defense took shots at James White's credibility, and the prosecution had nothing to go from with Peggy's behavior. She was an elementary school teacher, an avid churchgoer known to constantly help the less fortunate, which ironically was how the whole situation came about. The defense raised the huge concept of forensic analysis with the autopsy, fact-finding. They brought up the idea that a baseball bat could not be the weapon used to create this injury, and they thought the stab wounds were consistently left out during the case. Watch the recreation portrayed by the defense from the forensic files that gives a reasonable explanation to what could have happened.
If Dr. Sperry was correct, the murder didn't happen the way James White said. There were now 2 scenarios as to how Jack Wilson was murdered. Neighbors saw him on the front lawn around 5 p.m., hammering the political poster into the ground with a baseball bat. Using Dr. Sperry's interpretation, he was then attacked by at least 2 individuals. During the struggle, Wilson's hyoid bone was fractured. He was struck at least 9 times in the head and at least once in the shoulder, creating the puncture wound in the back of his neck. Then stabbed twice in the abdomen. The body was then placed in a tarp and carried into the house, dropped onto the wooden floor, and then turned 180 degrees. His head brushed against the doorway molding, leaving a blood stain and the swirling blood pattern on the floor. They smeared blood onto the bat so it would look like the murder weapon, took the fireplace poker and knife, and fled.
I repeat, they discovered the deceased beaten with what is believed to be a bat that was found nearby with blood on the bat. He was also discovered with 2 stab woundings. The most striking thing I have ever heard a prosecutor say is that facts are not evidence, and in doing so, a woman is serving her life out behind bars.
It didn't make a damn how Dr. Wilson got killed. The question was, who did it? And James White admitted to doing it, whether he stomped him, beat him with a bat, beat him with a stick. But that's the type of bull that experts try and sell to juries. What killed Dr. Wilson was not the issue. The issue was, did Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe conspire with James White to kill Jack Wilson? And Sperry brings in this photograph of something that happened in a book and shows the jury and says, oh, it couldn't have been a bat. What difference does it make?
The conclusion of Peggy Lowe's case was an acquittal.
Would you read the verdict for me, please? We, the jury, found the defendant not guilty.
Peggy Lowe cannot be retried for her crime, and Betty Wilson has used up all her appeals. The biggest finding of reasonable doubt is that it is impossible for one sister to be innocent and the other guilty when the cases were upon the exact same basis. The strongest debate for Betty's innocence is the idea of reasonable doubt. Highlighted by her sister's acquittal, there is much more in depth to the doubt. The testimony of James White not only changed several times in both cases, but his credibility is easily shot through the history of criminal conduct.
The whole case rested on a man's testimony. The man is a liar, a child molester, shot his own men in Vietnam. He's been on psychedelic drugs. He's a drunk. He's a dope addict. He's a cocaine user.
He had just come out of a mental institution when I met him, where he heard voices that he could not discern if they were real voices or imaginary voices.
If you were about to be sent to death row and given the possibility of parole after 7 years, who in their right mind wouldn't take that deal? Not only does his testimony raise reasonable doubt, but his claim to guess he killed the man with the bat. He never even admitted to the crime, which given the scenario was probably the most reasonable claim, was shredded into pieces in Peggy Lowe's case by forensic experts. The car that was found not to have fingerprints on it should have been all the reason to acquit Betty Wilson or throw James White's testimony all the way out of the window. The case itself was a case of the prosecutor said versus the defense's findings, and when they couldn't find anything else to make their case credible, they attacked her for having an open marriage with a black man. I could understand the conviction if there was evidence of James White in Betty's car, if there were bank records of a withdrawal nearing $2,500 or $5,000 days before the attack, and better yet, if Peggy Lowe had been found guilty of the crime as well. Now, here comes the big kick. After both trials were concluded in 1994, James White gave a sworn affidavit to his testimony saying that he never met Betty, never conspired with Peggy, and he made it all up. It was then for Betty to be freed from her case, James White would have to testify to the affidavit under oath. After all this is presented, he then claims he was coerced into making the statement. Ironically, it was now the prosecutors didn't believe a word he said when they believed everything that he said during the trials.
Prosecutor Jimmy Fry didn't believe a word of White's new version of events. He went to prison to talk with him.
I went down to interview him and reminded him that the deal, and I told him that if he lied about anything that was a material fact in the case that I tried, that I basically would put his sorry ass in the electric chair.
So you really think about it. This guy who had the deal of a lifetime made to spare his own life, when given an opportunity to tell his story, was backed into a wall, saying that if he tells the truth, they will take his life, is supposed to be fair? I understand the circus and the bullshit this man has been through, but what was so demeaning for the man to be placed in a situation where he wants to tell the truth to be manipulated like that? It's ironic to me that James White wanted to actually tell the truth, and that if there was a hunch in that case that would jeopardize the prosecution's reputation of the case, they were literally going to allow it over his dead body. James White would then take the stand and plead the fifth. He has never accepted any wrongdoing or told the truth about any of this. The next section I would like to introduce is my theory surrounding the case. It has no relevance to the case, and it only shines the light of raising reasonable doubt. First and foremost, I believe in Betty Wilson's innocence of the case. My theory of the attack was that when James White was given money through Alcoholics Anonymous, he made his way with the intention to rob the Wilsons for valuables and money because he was struggling. Drunk and high off drugs, he entered the home and was surprised by the idea that Dr. Wilson was home at the time and could not conduct the robbery the way he wanted. I think Dr. Wilson attacked James with the bat, and in the pursuing struggle, James White fled and looked for a weapon to use to fight back. After retrieving a fireplace poker, Dr. Wilson then went to look for the gun in the home. White then struck Dr. Wilson in the head when Dr. Wilson wasn't looking and gave fatal blows when he went down. And when he missed his head, he hit his shoulders and his abdomen, leaving the puncture wounds that were consistently left out, and then proceeded to stab him with a knife that is yet to be found. I believe he tried to drag the body elsewhere, but gave up when he didn't have enough strength to do so. After locating the gun, James then took the gun out of the home, possibly in an attempt to sell the weapon later on. I believe James was so intoxicated he remembers nothing of the crime, or not nearly as much as he told on the stand. James then went out and made claims to his friends later on about his murderous activity in the attempt that his criminal activity would give him a rep as a bad man. When the friend informed the police of their claims, they questioned James. By then they had already investigated the scene, and during the interrogation, the detectives put claims of Dr. Wilson being beaten by a bat, and James would then confess to what they were coaching him so that the questioning would be over. Note that in 2007, the American Bar Association released the rights of arrested persons, with findings that no person should be interrogated for no more than 4 hours and may continue after adequate rest is given to the person, and given his mental history, James White would be subject to an interrogation to not last more than 2 hours. I also believe to save himself, he was upset his own obsession with Peggy Lowe was not successful with her returning any affection. He decided to implement her and her sister for blackmail. When faced with this evidence, the police sought out to convict the two of them as well by any means necessary due to the media circus surrounding the case. I think when they were faced with the task of making a conspiracy case, instead of dropping the charges that were preposterous to begin with, James White led them to the gun that he stole and claimed that Betty Wilson gave it to him. But instead of asking why she wouldn't give him the case as well, they jumped to conclusions that she gave him the gun because she was in the same vicinity as he was at a certain time that Betty wasn't accounted for. Then they moved to the idea that they found her library book and never bothered to ask why it was in James White's possession, and just figured that it was a factor linking the two. I believe Peggy Lowe used the book to give him money anonymously so that he could be helped in his time of need. I think the strongest factor in my theory is that I believe James White was pressured by the police to make a case against the sisters in any way possible to save himself for the attention that the case brought from the media. I believe they coached him straight into his testimony and made it believable during the interrogation and throughout the trial. It was never about justice, it was about the photo shoot and the storyline. And when the media surrounding the story, the police brought themselves so far into the case that they couldn't face to have gotten this wrong. When faced with little evidence, with only the gun and the book, Would the prosecution seek to bring justice and drop the charges? No. They instead factored in the behavior of Betty Wilson's affairs with men and brought claims that she wanted her husband dead when the truth was far from it. I actually believe if there is any conspiracy in this case, it is between the police and James White to force the convictions against the sisters, and if you needed any evidence of that, the police threatened to put James White in the electric chair when he was to testify under oath following his sworn affidavit that he made everything up. While my theory may not be proven or true, it is much more believable given the circumstances surrounding the case's testimony from James White. Truth is, no one really knows what happens that day for the deceased. I would say the perpetrator as well, but if James White is the perpetrator, it is likely himself that he doesn't even know everything that transpired from that day. The forensic analysis gave more of a fact-based finding than the police jumping to conclusions ever did in this case. And what is disheartening is that Betty Wilson has been imprisoned for this conspiracy for 26 years and is to be remained there for the rest of her life. I have conducted through research and reviewed this case so much, but it really doesn't take a rocket scientist to truly realize that something is wrong here. There are books, film, and article resources that you can find in regards to finding out information for the case. The book Killer for Hire by Barbara Lunsford reviews over 6 years worth of research in regards to this case. She submits a theory consistent to the prosecutions from Peggy Wilson's case about the crime scene being staged and that the crime took place elsewhere by more than one assailant. The episode The Wilson Murder on HLN's Forensic Files showcases the lack of forensic evidence and a briefing about the autopsy in relation to the case. In an episode of On the Case with Paula Zahn's Twin Killings, Zahn gives a more personal outtake on the case and how it has affected Betty in her days behind bars. There are tons of articles written on the case from the days Betty was locked up until recent days. Even if you want to see how much the prosecution tried to paint a picture of Betty as a hostile assailant, you can watch the interviews of the prosecution about the case from their perspective on Investigation Discovery's Deadly Women Sins of the Sisters. My proposition to all of you watching is to put pressure on the state of Alabama and the Huntsville Police Department to admit their wrongdoings in this case. Governor Kay Ivey needs to review the case and furthermore needs to be pressured for a pardon, retrial, clemency, or parole. The most important thing here is to find out the truth, and if the truth can't be found, the conviction should be vacated. I also submit to the Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall to look into the behavior surrounding the police and the prosecutor who investigated this matter and tried it in court. I also submit to the U.S. Department of Justice to see the case and review the matters surrounding Betty Wilson. I believe in Betty's innocence, but more importantly, her guilt has never been proven. I actually believe in her innocence so much as if they were to tell her that she would be released if she would admit to the conspiracy, I believe she would choose to remain behind bars. Betty Wilson is now 74 and remains incarcerated. She spends her days practicing sewing and writing to her children. As her age is gaining, my wish is to see her live her life outside of prison before she passes away. The hard reality is that if a parole is granted, she can be released from prison, but the state would not have to admit to their wrongdoings. While I would be satisfied for her release, it is still wrong for the state not to admit that they handled the case wrong to protect themselves from backlash in a civil trial. I just want the truth to be found and to not hold Mrs. Wilson accountable any longer. In every argument I present, I always have to bring the case of devil's advocate, this being extremely influential to the case presented for the release of Betty Wilson. While the truth has yet to be found, there is the smallest chance in the world that maybe she wasn't framed for her crime. Say if by chance the whole case is found out to be the truth. Say Mrs. Wilson conspired to kill her husband and the prosecutors brought justice with the little evidence found. The idea that if the truth cannot be found in the long run, here's a reason why she should be granted release if the review comes back inconclusive. In 2013, Casey Anthony was tried for the murder of her daughter. As a court could not find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, she cannot be tried unless further evidence is applied in the case. In the case, forensic analysis experts testified that human remains were present in the trunk of Anthony's car. The jury did not convict based upon the behavior of the mother. They concluded she was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
As to the charge of first-degree murder, verdict as to count 1, We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty, so say we all, dated at Orlando, Orange County, Florida, on this 5th day of July, 2011, signed foreperson.
Now, I'm not here to share my opinions on the case, but I'm presenting the argument that if there was more conclusive evidence in her case and she walks away freely, why shouldn't Betty? Brock Turner, while in no relation to a murder, committed the heinous crime of sexual assault of an unconscious victim in 2015. With evidence presented, he was convicted of 3 felonies and sentenced to 6 months in prison for the crime of rape. For a case with much more evidence and based on facts and not testimony, the man was released after serving only 3 months of his sentence and walks freely today. Lauren Herzog was a serial killer who was tried and convicted of his crimes following confession of his crimes. Not only were his appeals granted, but his 78-year sentence was overturned following the finding that many of his confessions were coerced. This man, who was a known serial killer, was granted parole in 2010. He had as many as 3 to 19 known victims and was granted to see life outside of prison. Had he not committed suicide in 2012, he would only be 53 today. Michael Keith Moon was granted parole more than once and after every release either killed or attempted to kill someone again. In 1981, he was convicted of stabbing a woman to death in Reno, Nevada. After his release from prison in 1991, he was then convicted of attempted murder for the repeated stabbing of a man in a bar in Woodstock, Illinois. He was released in 2005. 3 years later, he was convicted of second-degree murder after killing a 24-year-old man in California. In 2014, he was granted parole and began living in a halfway house in downtown San Diego outside of prison walls. These are all cases where people have been granted opportunities they most likely didn't deserve, but in the opposite circumstances of Betty. Why should Mrs. Wilson continue to suffer at the hands of the Huntsville Police Department the remainder of her life? Justice in America was made to keep tragedies like this from happening. There has to be a much better way of handling this case. I've written to the governor of Alabama a letter of request for the pardon. I wrote the governor speaking about freedom and how in America we are taught that you are innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I spoke about the mishaps of the case concerning Betty Wilson and how there is a lady in prison in Alabama for over 2 decades of a faulty investigation, trial, and conviction. I wrote the letter with the intention to review her case and to let something be done over this case of Betty Wilson. I wrote about my exchange of letters with Mrs. Wilson with the understanding that she has accepted that she will likely die behind bars, and I for one cannot accept such a miscarriage of justice to happen here. Betty Wilson may not be the perfect human being, and neither am I. Yet, even then, the worst human beings should be tried and convicted of their crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. William Blackstone once quoted, "It is better to let 10 guilty persons escape than to let 1 innocent suffer." I reach out to the governor, and I submit to everyone who cares. Before you jump to any conclusions, research the case. Don't simply jump to conclusions because of my video. Although it is very informative, trust but verify. I also ask most importantly to share this video and bring awareness to this miscarriage of justice. And if you would like to change your profile picture to a Betty Wilson photo with a link of the video in the description. And if you feel as strongly as I do, I submit to those who want to get involved to reach out to Governor Kay Ivey, the Alabama Attorney General Steve Marsh, Matthew Whitaker at the United States Department of Justice to find out the truth about this case. I believe this case is flawed, and the conviction was the goal and not justice. It is also important for Mrs. Wilson to be exonerated of her convictions and not just paroled, even though it is extremely important to me to simply get her from behind bars. There needs to be a pressure on the folks at the top to find out what really happened. What lingers upon me every day is Betty Wilson's health and age. Betty Wilson is now going on 74 and has already accepted that she will likely die behind bars. I stress the immediate action of the case to be looked at, because if that were to occur, it would be the worst thing that we can do as people. We have done it for Meek Mill, and now we honestly need to do this for Betty. She has reached out to me in a personal letter, and if anyone would like to write to her, I would be glad to give you her information. Most importantly, let's make this happen. Thank you.
Dear Jean, just received your kind message and want to thank you. It has been a while since anyone has heard of my situation. How did you learn about my case? Oh shoot, now I reread your letter and see television. Here's another twist for you. The past 15 years have been spent trying to get DNA testing, but the state of Alabama has fought with everything they have to prevent that. Tell me from where you find inner peace. I found it in the hope of heaven by the way of Jesus. He gives me a peace and joy nothing on earth can provide. Your letter does give me a happy feeling, and I hope to hear from you again. You sound like a kind person and a young person. Am I correct on either count? Please do not feel you should write me again. My children infrequently write because it's a busy world out there. I'm sure you have a life full of things to do as well. I have a friend in New Jersey. She was a paralegal for the Innocence Project in New York City for a few years, and we became close. We still are. She left New York City, went to grad school, had a baby boy, and loves the pace of Jersey. Hope to hear from you, but if not, it's okay. I really do understand. Fondly, Betty.
Betty still maintains she's an innocent woman, claims that have been tempered by all those years behind bars.
Do you think you will spend the rest of your life in prison?
Yes, I do. I do.